Cheaters. Unfortunately, if you're on PC, they are still somewhat common to encounter, especially in things like the Trials of Osiris, where a lot of things are on the line, people's egos in particular. So, how do you counter it? How do you kill somebody who's able to take your head off before you barely poke cover? How did Aztecross and Luckyy counter their cheaters and end up actually winning the game? Is it the cheater's bad game sense? Of course, there's part of it. Is it the cheater's inability to adapt? Yeah, sure. But it's also the particular strategy that they use that we refer to in our Wolfpack tactics as the Alamo. Welcome back, Guardians, to another Dream Team video. I'm your humble host, Musin777, and welcome to the second episode of Wolfpack for Dummies. In this series, we essentially explain some of the team-based tactics, essentially like fire team mechanics, that you and your team can help utilize in our strategy we call the Wolfpack. And before we begin, just like I will say it in every single video we have regarding Wolfpack, if you want to understand what we're about to talk about, I highly recommend you go watch this video right here. It's essentially like a prereq if you were to consider this like a class course. So go watch that if you're interested, if you want to get caught up on everything we're going to talk about, because a lot of it's about to not make sense, all right? And before we get too far into this as well, be sure to subscribe. I've seen from my studies, I've done a bit of research, and science has proven that people who subscribe to TDT Productions has a 31% increase in their ability to 720 ladder stall YY no scope wall bang people. So I'm just throwing that out there. It's not me, it's science. Let's talk about what a Alamo is. The Alamo is a defensive tactic in which each team positions in cover, and each covers a different zone. Each role should be within ranges appropriate to them, and once established, they should quickly scan 180 degrees to see if they can see a teammate looking down the same zone. If they are, let's say two people are doubling down coverage on the same zone, they should change their zone as quickly as possible. The basic idea is that you want to be able to cover each other in such a way that you're able to maintain a line of sight of your teammates so that if they get pushed, they can get covered by you or somebody else, while also being able to cover the widest range of area as possible while holding down a zone. This strategy is incredibly effective in things like the Trials of Osiris if you say have an enemy team who absolutely refuses to push you, they're just staying in the back with their snipers, or if you get a team that decides they want to be hyper aggressive but very straight liney. This strategy is very good at shutting down both of those things. Let's talk about each of them and why they counter cheaters in just a bit. So let's start with the over-aggressive straight line strategy. The thing with that over-aggressive, what we call a full dive, is that it is very obviously front-loaded. So if you come up against a team that is each in a position to cover, able to shoot at you from different angles, it makes it very difficult for you to dive on a zone because you have to aggress 3, 4, 5, 6, however many people you've got in your team or however many people you've got established in your Alamo all at once. It's not like you can just focus your aggression to a single point and kill it. You have to address the entire team if you're going to do that. Of course, there's a way to work around it. In fact, if you caught our last video talking about the suppress and flank, that's probably the best tactic you can do in order to break up an Alamo, but that's neither here nor there. What about the highly defensive team, the team that likes to just sit in the back and snipe? Well, at that point, you're kind of playing the same game, but there's a caveat to this. If your team, whoever's essentially calling tactical for your team, whoever's being the brains of the team for the time, if they realize that you're able to control a major point on the map, what we call a POI, a point of interest, and you can establish an Alamo on that point, you really don't have to play their game at all after that. You can essentially just establish an Alamo, let's say it's on Trials, on wherever the flag spawns, and you're good. You don't even have to engage on the enemy team. And if they happen to try to engage on you, they have to play at their disadvantage. They have to try to come aggress you when they're trying to play defensively just by default. It's a great way to just essentially say, no, you come get us if you're playing on the defensive. And regarding cheaters, a lot of cheaters don't tend to understand that game sense style of thing. They don't really understand that, hey, we could just kind of control this space and we're good. They get greedy. They get impatient. I mean, if you just look at this this X-ray here, you can see the size of a normal person's brain and the size of a cheater's brain. So they can't understand what's going on. They have been rolling teams up to this point. So when they encounter you and you give them, well, a lesson in patience, they're going to have a hard time. There's plenty of different ways you can optimize your Alamo as well, especially within Destiny where 3-peeking is a thing. 3-peeking is an absolutely valid strategy against, well, especially cheaters because, I mean, nothing's off the table when cheating's involved, right? But, I mean, in general, you can just get free information. Do I condone 3-peeking? Probably not, but against cheaters, again, nothing is sacred at that point. As you can see from both Aztecross's and Luckyy's game, Both of the time that they were trying to fight against those cheaters got impatient. You can use that to your advantage, and you should use that to your advantage. Let's talk about some of the mechanics of how an Alamo works. An Alamo essentially has 4 steps. Step number 1, the call. Somebody on your team recognizes what's happening, and they call out Alamo. And they should call out to a specific spot where they want to Alamo. So let's say Alamo A flag, Alamo C, Alamo heavy, Alamo spawn point, whatever it may be. Call out the position that you want to establish your defense on. The second step is for everybody to echo that call out, so they can essentially just give you some type of like heads up, like, yeah, I heard you, copy that. Or they also just echo back Alamo up, whatever it may be, just to make sure that they understand that you understand what's going on. It helps make sure everybody's on the same page. Step number 3 is the check. Establish your coverage point. You should call out to your team where you're covering, right? So if you're covering the right side of this zone, you say, I'm covering right lane, or I'm covering middle, I'm covering back, whatever it may be. Make sure that everybody has a unique piece of area to cover, a unique slice of pie that they're looking down, all right? And let's say, for example, that there's more guardians than there is zones, then it's totally fine to double down, and typically you would just double down on wherever you think the enemies are most likely to come out of. That's totally fine. Step number 4 is to react. As in general, you're going to be getting some type of contact hopefully soon. Hopefully you're not just sitting way too far in the back of the map letting them control zones on you. You're at this point just looking for something to collapse on. Wait for the enemy to try to make a push. If you're spread out wide enough, which you should be in a position that you can counter anything that they try to straight dive you with. Now, if you happen to get, let's say, suppressed and flanked, that might be a different story for another video. But in general, you should be capable of handling any sort of straight dive coming at you. The thing you have to be careful of when you are doing the react part of this is that you do not give them a poke or a peek or a pick before the fight even happens. So for example, if you're going sniper v sniper, you don't give them the opportunity to take your head off, because then your Alamo is weaker and it's far easier to push you at that point. Just stay patient. Allow your team to be your backups. Have confidence in your team to be able to support you. I know sometimes that can be easier said than done, but it is absolutely crucial, especially in defense, to trust that your teams, especially the person that you're capable of communicating with, is going to be able to cover you a little bit. In terms of each role, the alpha should be nearest wherever they think the immediate action is going to come from. They might be able to occasionally slide out and get a shotgun kill on something if they're doing something like that with the shotgun, fusion rifle, whatever it may be. They might be able to see, hey, the enemy is kind of positioned close enough to me that I think I can spring out and take a quick advantage of it. And they should be in a position to do so. Not just that, but if they happen to need to pull back a bit, they've got the tools that are best to do so. Beta should be just off and to the side, covering obviously a different lane of coverage, right? Able to maintain the line of sight of its alpha. It is important that the betas and the alphas are able to see one another in order to swap out, because sometimes the beta might have to engage into a fight, or the alpha might have to engage into a fight, and they need to swap for one another. Those two roles are the most similar with one another, so being able to swap for them is good. It also means that, let's say that the alpha establishes into a lane and then say the enemies pivot to a new position to cover, the beta can then take over that longer line of sight if need be. Gammas should be essentially the opposite position of a beta. So, imagine a triangle. If the alpha's on the tip of the triangle, the beta's on the left-hand tip of the triangle, the gamma should be on the right-hand tip of that triangle. So he can cover sort of the beta, sort of the alpha as need be. He can provide that backup to his team as necessary, and he can swap out, let's say there's no betas, he can swap it out as he needs. Omega should be the furthest thing in the back. Preferably, he should be looking over the most zones, as he has typically the longest range tools as well as the biggest information gathering tools to be able to see what's going on, so he can give the best information because he's essentially got a bird's eye view.
Hey, me, when you call for an Alamo, are you expecting an immediate fallback, or are you expecting like a 2 to 3 seconds before everyone can finish their engagements and then fall back?
Essentially what you're asking here is, how fast should I fall back? Should I completely disengage from this fight and fall back into the Alamo, or should I try to finish this fight out? That's a really hard question to give. It's essentially a judgment call, right? At the end of the day, it's going to be a judgment call. If you think that you're in the advantage in that fight, then probably should try to finish it out. However, if you think that it's about a 50-50, or you feel like that enemy teammate is doing pretty good, it might be able to surprise you, then just fall back. It's far better for you to be with your team and alive than away from your team and dead in all respects, right? Even if you happen to trade with that target, if the enemy already has coverage of that zone, especially if an Alamo is being called, probably want to fall back near immediately.
Misum, how do I pull somebody into my team with Alamo?
Baiting isn't really your goal in the Alamo. Your goal with the Alamo is to essentially shut down any aggression. Hell, if you can completely discourage them from pushing you at all, then that's a plus. You're not really interested too much in baiting. If you're trying to bait, you're probably looking for a tactic that we call the bait and pull, which of course will be covered in later videos.
When you're setting up an Alamo, can you call out that you're guarding a position and not an area?
I think that might mean that you might not understand what the Alamo is trying to do. So let me clarify. The Alamo is, in its goal, trying to establish a position, right? Whatever that may be. You're trying to defend a position. That's all of you all at the same time, right? Then each unit within that Alamo is trying to cover an area in order to cover that position. I hope that helps.
Hey Lux, is it true that spiders have overshields in Australia?
Yes, they have the most beefy overshields you've ever seen.
Does Alamo work on every map?
Ooh, great question. It really comes down to if you're able to hold a POI, a point of interest, something like the heavy flag, maybe B flag, maybe the spawn point in comp or trials, something like that. If you're not in a position where you can safely establish an Alamo on one of those POIs, then it's not worth attempting, because most of the time you'll end up pushing a defensive strategy into an aggressive position, which just ends up being sloppy. You might have people who can get into the zone and bust it up, which is what the alphas and betas are for, but yeah, don't force it. Don't force it.
So, who calls the Alamo?
In short, anybody who thinks it's necessary. Everybody should try to follow along with whatever the call is given, but yeah, whoever feels like, hey, it might be a good time to Alamo right now, should probably be the person that calls it out.
What kind of weapons are good for an Alamo?
It's not necessarily that there's any bad weapons per se, it's just whatever you're comfortable with. Longer range weapons in general, of course, will do better in this type of situation. I generally recommend having a good Omega or at least a decent Beta to be able to cover your furthest back, as they'll have some type of long range tool, whether that be something like a sniper rifle, a bow, a scout rifle, whatever it may be. But in general, it's not necessarily that there's a bad weapon per se, it's just whatever you're comfortable with doing. You should be in position according to where your Wolfpack role is supposed to be anyway, so you should be able to take advantage of it that way.
Is Alamo only playing defensive?
Yeah, Alamo's pretty much exclusively for defense. You're pretty immobile when you're setting up an Alamo. Yeah, it's almost exclusively a defensive tool, so I wouldn't recommend trying to do this offensively. Of course, you can get into a zone and then establish it. You could argue that that's an offensive tool, but I mean, you're playing defense one way or another. The whole goal of an Alamo is to establish a really good, well-circled defense.
Do I want to build my loadout to expect an Alamo?
You should have some tools to Alamo. Should you spec specifically for an Alamo? No, not necessarily, because again, a weapon that fires bullets should be capable of supplying defense to an Alamo. So no, I wouldn't particularly spec into playing an Alamo. Gammas should definitely put at least 1 or 2 tools into their tool belt for Alamoing purposes, especially on a different game, say something like Overwatch. Gammas should probably have like something in their tool belt, right? Other games will be able to express how the Wolfpack role operates a little bit differently. So yeah, Gammas probably, maybe Betas, probably Omegas, Alphas definitely not. But again, weapons that fire bullets is good enough. But hey, I hope that helps. I hope the next time you come up against a team in Trials that is allowing you to take the center spawn point, but is just looking to snipe you out and they're really damn good at it, I hope this helps you establish a defensive tactic or establish a winning strategy for you. And I also hope that if you happen to encounter a cheater, let's say you're on PC, it doesn't happen too much here on console, but if you happen to be on PC and you happen to encounter a cheater, try the strategy out. You might be surprised. You might be able to pull an Aztecross, you might be able to pull a Luckyy, and end up winning that game anyway. Thank you all so much for joining me. Bless your faces, and deuces.